Picture this. It's the dead of winter in 823 after Christ, and somewhere along the jagged coastline of what we now call Norway, a woman is fighting for her life. The wind is howling through gaps in the wooden walls of a fishing village so small it doesn't even have a name that history bothered to remember. Inside a smoky hut that smells of seal oil and desperation, a difficult birth is taking its toll on everyone involved. When the baby finally arrives, after what the village women would later describe as a battle worthy of the gods themselves, the first thing anyone notices isn't his cry, it's his left arm. Withered, twisted, useless by any standard that Viking society would recognize. The midwife, a woman whose hands had delivered half the village over 3 decades, takes one look at this child and declares him cursed by the gods. And you have to understand, in a world where physical strength meant the difference between life and death, between respect and ridicule, between eating and starving, this wasn't just a medical diagnosis. This was a death sentence wrapped in superstition. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because while the midwife is muttering about curses and angry spirits, the boy's mother, a woman whose name has been lost to time but whose insight would change the world, looks down at her son and sees something entirely different. She sees Odin's wisdom, teaching strength through weakness, teaching adaptation through necessity. They name him Bjorn, son of Ulf, the Steady. And from the moment this kid can walk, something becomes painfully obvious to everyone in the village. Traditional Norse society has no place for him. Think about what it meant to be a young Viking male in the early 9th century. Your entire identity, your entire future, revolved around your ability to swing an axe, pull an oar, heft a spear. The Norse axe, and this is crucial to understand, wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool of survival, a symbol of manhood, a ticket to respect. These axes were straight-hafted, broad-bladed instruments that required 2 strong arms for proper control. The swing came from the shoulders, the power from the back, the accuracy from years of muscle memory that started in childhood. Bjorn couldn't do any of that. Not properly. Not the way his father could, not the way the other boys in the village could, not the way Viking society demanded. So what does a kid like this do? He adapts, but not in the way you might expect. While other children are learning the traditional overhead chop, the side sweep, the defensive parry, Bjorn is obsessing over something entirely different. Movement. Balance. The way things flow. He watches eagles, not just watches them, but studies them with the intensity of a scholar. How do they curve their flight? How do they use air currents instead of fighting them? How do they turn what looks like weakness, hollow bones, delicate feathers into devastating efficiency? He studies water. Not just water, but the way water moves down mountain stones, always finding the easiest path, never fighting the landscape, always flowing around obstacles, always finding a way. And this is where young Bjorn starts to understand something that generations of Viking warriors have missed entirely. At age 14, he enters apprenticeship with Master Thorgrim Ironbeard, and this is where our story really begins to gather momentum. Thorgrim's family has been keeping smithing secrets for 8 generations. 8 generations of knowledge passed down father to son, master to apprentice, jealously guarded and carefully preserved. But apprenticeship for a boy with 1 good arm? That's not just unusual, it's practically unheard of. The other apprentices, strong-backed farm boys with dreams of forging weapons for jarls and kings, they take one look at Bjorn and immediately christen him with nicknames that would follow him for years. Half-strike, broken wing, the kind of cruel accuracy that only children can manage. And here's the thing about being mocked, about being underestimated, about being written off before you even begin. It either breaks you completely, or it forces you to find strengths you never knew you had. Bjorn finds strengths. While his fellow apprentices are learning to hammer metal into submission through brute force, Bjorn is developing something entirely different. He's learning to listen, to the metal itself, to hear what Master Thorgrim later describes as the song that iron sings when it's being worked properly. Where others hear only the clash of hammer against metal, Bjorn hears harmonies. He hears the whisper of steel that's too hot, the groan of iron that needs more time in the forge, the perfect ring that means the metal is ready to be shaped. And Thorgrim notices. The old master, keeper of 8 generations of secrets, starts to see something in this broken-winged apprentice that others are missing entirely. Not just talent is common enough, but understanding. Bjorn doesn't just work metal, he converses with it. Then comes 845 after Christ, and everything changes. Raiders return from Francia, that's modern-day France, and they're not returning in triumph. They're returning with captured weapons and tales that don't make sense. Tales of defeat, of Viking shields that failed, of traditional axes that couldn't find their mark, of Frankish defenders who somehow held their ground against Norse fury. And here's what's really disturbing to the warriors listening to these tales. The Frankish weapons aren't better, not in terms of craftsmanship, not in terms of metal quality, not in terms of any measure that Norse smiths understand. They're actually inferior in most ways. But somehow, they're getting through Viking defences with disturbing ease. Most of the village blames cowardice. Some mutter about Frankish sorcery. A few suggest the gods have turned against them. Bjorn does something different. He studies. Through the long winter nights of 845 into 846, while other apprentices are drinking ale and boasting about future conquests, Bjorn is in Thorgrim's workshop, turning captured Frankish weapons over in his hands, measuring angles, testing balance points, trying to understand what he's seeing. And then comes the spring festival of 847 after Christ. Picture the scene. The entire village gathered around a massive bonfire, ale flowing freely, dancing and singing that probably hasn't changed much since Bjorn's grandfather's time. Traditional dances, traditional music, traditional everything. But Bjorn isn't drinking, he's watching. Specifically, he's watching the dancers move around the fire. And in that moment, in that single, crystalline moment that sometimes changes the entire course of human history, he sees what generations of Viking warriors have missed. The human body doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in arcs, in curves, in flowing motions that follow the natural architecture of joints and muscles and bones. But the Norse axe, the traditional, time-honored, 8 generations of tradition Norse axe, is built for straight-line attacks, built to fight against human nature instead of working with it. That night, working in secret while the village sleeps off the festival, Bjorn forges something that has never existed before. A curved blade. Not dramatically curved, not obviously different to casual observation, but angled 15 degrees from the haft. 15 degrees. That's all. But those 15 degrees compensate perfectly for his disability while doing something nobody expected. They multiply striking force instead of reducing it. His first test comes the next morning. An old shield, propped against the outside wall of Thorgrim's workshop. One strike with his new design. The crash that follows sends such a shock through the village that warriors come running from their houses, thinking the settlement is under attack. Instead, they find Bjorn standing over cleanly severed wood that would have taken 3 strikes with a traditional axe, standing over proof that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from strength, but from necessity, not from following tradition, but from questioning everything everyone thinks they know. And, in that moment, staring at the impossible evidence before them, the warriors of that nameless Norwegian village are looking at the future. They just don't know it yet. Now, here's something most people don't understand about innovation in the medieval world. It wasn't just about having a better idea. It was about surviving the political earthquake that better idea inevitably created. By the summer of 849 after Christ, word of Bjorn's moon crescents, that's what people started calling them, has spread through the trading networks like wildfire. And when I say trading networks, I'm talking about a communication system that connected Iceland to Constantinople, Norway to Ireland, the Baltic to the Black Sea. Vikings weren't just raiders. They were merchants, and merchants talk. So picture this. You're a master smith whose family has controlled axe-making for the Uppsala kings for 2 centuries. Your great-great-grandfather forged weapons for legendary jarls. Your techniques are trade secrets passed down through blood and sworn oaths. Your apprentices pay you not just for training, but for the privilege of joining an ancient brotherhood. And then some crippled boy from a fishing village nobody's heard of creates something that makes your 2 centuries of expertise look obsolete overnight. This is Grimnar Gold Hand's situation. And Grimnar isn't just any smith, he's the smith, leader of the guild that controls weapon distribution across 5 kingdoms. When jarls need axes for their warriors, they come to Grimnar. When kings need to ensure loyalty through selective access to quality weapons, they go through Grimnar's network. The political stakes here are enormous, and this is something we need to understand if we want to grasp what happens next. Medieval smith guilds weren't just craft organizations, they were power structures. They controlled who got weapons, when they got them, and how good those weapons were. In a world where the quality of your axe could determine whether you lived or died in battle, that's not just economic influence, that's political control. Bjorn's open teaching threatens all of that, because unlike the traditional guild system, where knowledge is hoarded and apprenticeships are limited, Bjorn is sharing his techniques with anyone willing to learn. He's not building a monopoly, he's starting a revolution. And revolutions, as we know, tend to make existing power structures very, very nervous. So Grimnar does what threatened establishments have always done, throughout history. He demands proof. Public proof. Proof that will either discredit this upstart or legitimize the old ways. The Thing of Trondheim, in 851, after Christ, becomes the stuff of legend. And when I say thing, I'm not talking about an object. I'm talking about the Norse equivalent of a public trial, a political assembly, and a sporting event all rolled into one. Picture a Roman circus, but with more mud, more ale, and significantly more potential for actual death. Grimnar arrives with an entourage that reads like a who's who of Northern Europe's military elite. But more importantly, he brings 3 champions. 3 men whose reputations for violence are so established that their names alone can clear a room. Hauk Tree Splitter, Orm Shield Bane, and Magnus Iron Skull. Let me paint you a picture of what these men represent. Hauk Tree Splitter earned his name by allegedly cutting down a full-grown oak with a single axe. Orm Shield Bane has never met a shield. He couldn't split. Magnus Iron Skull? Well, the story goes that he once took a direct hit to the head from a warhammer and kept fighting. Against these 3 living legends, Grimnar proposes to put one disabled young smith with an experimental weapon. The terms are beautifully simple. Bjorn with 1 curved axe against all 3 champions with traditional weapons. Winner takes all, not just bragging rights, but the right to determine the future of Norse weapon making. And here's where the story takes a turn that nobody, absolutely nobody, sees coming. The combat begins at dawn. Picture the scene. Morning mist rolling off the fjord, hundreds of spectators forming a rough circle, the smell of wood smoke and nervous sweat in the air. On one side, 3 of the most feared warriors in the north, armed with axes that represent centuries of proven technique. On the other side, a young man with a withered arm and a weapon that looks almost identical to theirs, except for a subtle curve that most people can't even see. Hauk charges first, because that's what champions do. They take the initiative, they use their reputation to intimidate, they end fights quickly with overwhelming force. His massive overhead swing comes down like the wrath of Thor himself, a traditional attack that has ended 1,000 fights before this one. The kind of blow that splits shields, shatters bones, and sends opponents to Valhalla with a single strike. But here's the thing about Bjorn's curved blade. It doesn't meet force with force. It redirects it. When Hauk's axe meets Bjorn's parry, something happens that violates everything these spectators think they know about combat. Instead of the crushing impact everyone expects, instead of the thunderclap of metal against metal that should send the smaller man flying, the force slides away, deflected, redirected, turned against itself, and Bjorn's counterstrike, following the natural arc of recovery that his curved blade creates, opens. Hauk from shoulder to hip before the big man even realizes what's happened. 1 heartbeat. That's all it takes for the first legend to fall. Orm and Magnus don't hesitate. They're experienced enough to know that hesitation kills, smart enough to recognize that whatever just happened, it's not sorcery, it's technique. They attack together, coordinated, professional, using the numerical advantage that should guarantee victory. But the curved blade's efficiency allows something that traditional axes simply cannot. Bjorn flows between defense and attack without the recovery pause that straight blades require. While Orm is pulling back for his next strike, Bjorn is already moving to counter Magnus. While Magnus is adjusting his grip, Bjorn is flowing back to deflect Orm's follow-up. 50 heartbeats. That's how long it takes for all three champions to lie defeated in the mud of Trondheim. 50 heartbeats to overturn centuries of military tradition. But here's what's really fascinating about this moment. The violence solves nothing. Because innovation, real innovation, can't be stopped by combat. It can only be delayed, suppressed, or embraced. The winter of 853 to 854 after Christ brings the real test. And it's not a test of combat, prowess, or political maneuvering. It's a test of simple, brutal practicality. Heavy snowfall threatens starvation across the north. We're talking about weather so severe that it becomes a matter of historical record, the kind of winter that people measure other winters against for generations. Villages that don't have enough firewood die. Families that can't process game efficiently starve. Communities that can't clear forest for emergency shelter freeze. And here's where Bjorn's innovation proves its worth in ways nobody anticipated. Villages with curved axes clear forest 20% faster. They build emergency shelters more efficiently. They process game with less effort and less waste. In the fishing village of Nordheim, there's a moment that changes everything. Elder Solveig, a woman who initially opposed the new design on principle, because that's what elders do when young people start changing things, watches her granddaughter successfully split kindling with a curved hand axe. This is a girl too small for traditional tools, too weak for conventional techniques, but perfectly capable with the new design. The gods speak through usefulness, Solveig declares, and orders 20 axes for her clan. That single endorsement from a respected elder, based on practical results rather than combat demonstrations, breaks conservative resistance more effectively than any battlefield victory could have. Because here's the thing about revolutionary technology. It doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be better. And it doesn't need to convince everyone, it just needs to convince enough people to reach critical mass. By the end of that brutal winter, curved axes aren't curiosities anymore. They're necessities. They're the difference between survival and death, between prosperity and starvation, between old ways that no longer work and new ways that do. And Bjorn, standing in his workshop as spring returns to the north, realizes that he's done something far more significant than winning a fight or improving a tool. He's changed the world. And the world, as it turns out, was ready for changing. The only question now is, how far will these changes spread? And what will happen when they reach the attention of kings and emperors who have their own ideas about how the world should work? By 856 after Christ, something unprecedented is happening in the Viking world. The first true smithing school that accepts students based on ability rather than bloodline. And this isn't just a feel-good story about social progress. This is a fundamental shift in how knowledge gets transmitted, how innovation spreads, and how entire civilizations adapt to change. Bjorn establishes this school in Kaupang, and if you don't know Kaupang, you need to understand what this location represents. This isn't just another Viking settlement, this is one of Northern Europe's great trading centres, a place where merchants from Ireland meet traders from Russia, where silver from the Middle East changes hands for amber from the Baltic, where ideas travel as freely as goods. Setting up shop in Kaupang isn't an accident, it's a declaration. This knowledge belongs to the world, not just to Norway. Bjorn's 4 principal apprentices become legends in their own right. And here's what's fascinating about them. Each one discovers applications that Bjorn himself never imagined. Eirik Shipbuilder, and yes, that becomes his actual name, discovers that curved blades shape ship strakes with unprecedented precision. We're talking about the curved wooden planks that form a ship's hull, pieces that have to fit together with mathematical exactness if you don't want to sink in the middle of the North Sea. Traditional straight-bladed tools require multiple cuts, constant adjustment, and still leave gaps that need to be sealed with tar and prayers. Eirik's curved blades follow the natural grain of the wood, cutting curves in a single, smooth motion that produces joints so tight they barely need caulking. The result? Ships that are faster, more maneuverable, and significantly less likely to split apart in heavy seas. Then there's Astrid Firehair, and her story tells us something important about how innovation spreads beyond its original context. She's the first woman admitted to forge training, which is revolutionary enough by itself. But what makes her truly significant is that she sees applications nobody else is looking for. While the men are focused on weapons and shipbuilding, Astrid is developing specialized cooking and household variants. Curved blades for preparing food, for cutting cloth, for 100 domestic tasks that make daily life easier and more efficient. And here's the kicker. These domestic applications spread faster than the military ones, because they improve life for everyone, not just warriors. Gunnar the Precise takes the military applications in directions that would give modern weapons designers nightmares. He develops a weighted version that penetrates chainmail at angles impossible for straight blades. We're talking about a weapon that doesn't just cut through armor, it slides between the links, finding gaps that traditional weapons can't exploit. But the most fascinating apprentice might be young Sigurd One-Eye. Blind in one eye like his divine namesake, he can't rely on visual assessment the way other smiths do. So he develops something entirely new. Quality testing through sound. Properly forged curved blades ring at specific frequencies when struck. Too much carbon in the steel, and the pitch goes sharp. Not enough, and it goes flat. Improperly, heated, and the harmonics become discordant. Sigurd develops an ear so precise that he can detect flaws other smiths miss entirely, even when examining the blade visually. This is quality control at a level that won't be matched by mainstream manufacturing for another 1,000 years. But here's where the story really gets interesting. Because by 861 after Christ, these innovations are about to be field-tested in the most dramatic way possible. The Siege of Paris. Picture this. Ragnar Lothbrok's sons leading an assault on one of the most heavily fortified cities in Christendom, equipped entirely with curved axes. We're talking about a military force that represents the cutting edge literally of Viking warfare, attacking defenders who have every reason to believe they understand Norse tactics. The Frankish chronicles describe Vikings flowing over walls, like water over stones. That's not poetic license, that's tactical reality. Because curved axes find gaps in shield walls that straight blades cannot exploit. They slide around defensive positions instead of meeting them head-on. They turn the methodical, formation-based combat that Europeans have perfected into flowing, adaptive fighting that follows the contours of the battlefield rather than fighting against them. The psychological impact proves equally devastating. Frankish defenders have trained for predictable straight-line attacks, but curved strikes come from unexpected angles. Muscle memory that has been drilled for years becomes useless when the geometry of combat suddenly changes. Count Odo of Paris, a man who successfully defended the city against previous Viking attacks, offers £1,000 of silver for anyone who can bring him the secret of what he calls devil's sickles. £1,000 of silver. In modern terms, we're talking about a ransom that could buy a small kingdom. The fact that he's willing to pay that much tells us everything we need to know about how completely these new weapons have changed the tactical balance. But here's what's really remarkable. The innovation doesn't stop with military applications. It accelerates. Swedish Vikings carrying curved axes down Russian rivers discover that the design excels at shipbuilding in foreign timber. Russian oak handles differently than Norwegian pine, but the curved blade adapts to local wood characteristics better than traditional tools. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople elite Viking warriors, serving the Byzantine emperor, adopts the weapon by 868 after Christ, spreading influence to Byzantine military doctrine. Suddenly, the Eastern Roman Empire is dealing with tactical innovations that originated in a Norwegian fishing village. Arab merchants in Bulgar, the great trading center on the Volga, report northern steel that moves like eastern sabers but strikes like western hammers. They're describing something that doesn't fit existing categories, a fusion of techniques that shouldn't work together but somehow does. And here's the economic reality that drives everything else. Curved axes become currency. One quality blade trades for 3 traditional ones. Master smiths who can prove their training in Bjorn's techniques command prices that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. Bjorn, now wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, does something that cements his historical importance. He uses his profits to establish forges in Iceland, Ireland, and York, each adapted to local materials and fighting styles. This isn't just business expansion, it's knowledge distribution on a scale that won't be seen again until the printing press. Bjorn is creating a network of trained smiths who carry not just techniques, but principles. Not just the ability to make curved axes, but the understanding of why they work and how to adapt them to new challenges. In Iceland, they develop versions optimized for the volcanic iron available there. In Ireland, they create variants suited to the wetter climate and different fighting styles of Celtic warfare. In York, they blend Norse techniques with Anglo-Saxon metallurgy to produce hybrids that represent the best of both traditions. By the end of the 8th century, what started as one disabled young man's adaptation to personal limitation has become something unprecedented, a technological revolution that spans continents. But revolutions, as we know, always produce counter-revolutions, and the established powers of Europe are beginning to take notice of these changes in ways that will test everything Bjorn has built. The question now isn't whether his innovations will spread, they already have. The question is whether they'll survive the attention of kings and emperors who have their own ideas about how power should be distributed in the world. Bjorn Iron Hand's death in 876 after Christ comes not with the crash of battle or the drama of assassination, but with the quiet dignity that marks the end of a life well lived. He's 53 years old, standing at his forge while teaching a group of apprentices, hammer still in his good hand, when his heart simply stops. Picture the scene. Steam rising from the quenching bucket, the ring of metal against metal suddenly falling silent, young faces turning in confusion as their master collapses without warning or complaint. In his final moment, Bjorn is doing exactly what he's been doing for 30 years, passing knowledge to the next generation. His funeral draws thousands from across the Viking world, and this tells us something profound about what he's accomplished. Ships arrive from Dublin, carrying Irish smiths who learned their craft from Bjorn's students. Vessels from Novgorod bring Russian traders who've grown wealthy, selling curved axes to Byzantine markets. Longships from Reykjavik carry Icelandic metalworkers who adapted his techniques to volcanic iron. This isn't just a funeral, it's a gathering of a new kind of international community, bound together not by blood or politics, but by shared knowledge and mutual respect for innovation. The ritual itself becomes legend. In the Great Burning, mourners cast 8,000 curved axes onto Bjorn's pyre. 8,000. That's not symbolic destruction, it's the opposite. Each axe represents a life changed, a technique mastered, a tradition transformed. The axes aren't being destroyed, they're being consecrated, their metal returning to the elements that will birth new tools, new possibilities, new innovations. The smoke carries spark fragments across the fjord, and observers interpret this as Bjorn's knowledge spreading to the heavens. Whether you believe in Norse mythology or not, there's something poetic about that image. Innovation, ascending, becoming part of the cosmic order itself. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because death often tests whether an innovator's work was truly revolutionary or merely personal brilliance that dies with its creator. Bjorn's son, Ulf the Younger, inherits his father's position but not his genius for invention. And this turns out to be exactly what the movement needs, because Ulf possesses something equally valuable: organizational brilliance. Where Bjorn was an intuitive creator, Ulf is a systematic preservationist. He codifies his father's teachings into what become known as the Iron Scrolls, detailed instructions preserved through oral tradition, and carved markers that ensure the techniques will survive beyond any single smith or workshop. Think about what this represents: the transition from individual innovation to institutional knowledge, from genius-dependent breakthroughs to replicable systems, from revolution to evolution. By 900 after Christ, variations are emerging that would have amazed even Bjorn. The Danish hawkwing, optimized for cavalry combat. The Norwegian wave cutter, designed specifically for naval warfare. The Icelandic ice render, adapted for the extreme cold conditions that make traditional metal tools brittle and unreliable. Each variation represents not just adaptation, but understanding. These aren't crude copies, they're intelligent interpretations of underlying principles, applied to new challenges by smiths who truly comprehend what they're doing. But innovation always faces resistance, and some of that resistance comes from unexpected directions. Saxon smiths, desperate to compete with Viking weapon superiority, attempt to copy curved axes through examination of captured examples. But here's the thing about revolutionary technology. The visible innovation is often just the tip of an iceberg of invisible knowledge. They can see the curve, they can measure the angle, they can even approximate the shape. But they can't replicate the precise tempering required, the exact weight distribution that makes the weapon effective, or the subtle metallurgical knowledge that prevents the blade from shattering under stress. The result? Black market, false crescents. Flood England brittle imitations that look right but shatter on impact. Saxon warriors who trust their lives to these inferior copies pay the ultimate price for their faith in appearances over substance. This failure inadvertently protects Viking military advantage for another generation. It's a perfect example of how the most important aspects of innovation are often the ones you can't see, the knowledge that exists between the lines of any technical description. The Norman conquest of 1066 after Christ provides a fascinating case study in how technological advantage plays out over time. William's forces are still struggling against Saxon defenders wielding inferior copies, while Harald Hardrada's Norwegian forces carry true curved axes, bearing maker's marks traceable directly to Bjorn's original students. Even 2 centuries after Bjorn's death, the quality difference is so significant that battlefield archaeologists can identify which weapons were used by which army, simply by examining the metallurgy and construction techniques. But perhaps the most remarkable validation of Bjorn's legacy comes from an unexpected source. Modern metallurgists using computer modeling to analyze preserved examples of his work. What they discover would have amazed even Bjorn himself. The 15-degree curve that he developed through intuition and experimentation turns out to optimally multiply human force while minimizing stress fractures. Computer simulations confirm that his design achieves through empirical testing what required centuries of physics to explain mathematically. Bjorn achieved, through necessity and careful observation, what we now recognize as near-perfect engineering optimization. He solved problems that modern materials science approaches through complex mathematical modeling, using nothing but practical experience and careful attention to results. His true legacy, though, lies not in the metal, but in the methodology, in the revolutionary idea that tradition should be questioned, that limitations can become advantages, that knowledge belongs to anyone willing to learn rather than just those born to the right families. The curved axe stands as testament to something profound about human innovation. It comes not from strength but from necessity, not from perfection, but from the willingness to solve problems that others don't even see. In workshops across Northern Europe, smiths still test their work by the sound it makes when struck, a technique developed by Sigurd One-Eye that survived because it works better than visual inspection alone. In shipyards from Dublin to Novgorod, curved tools shape hulls with efficiency that straight blades cannot match. In battlefields across the medieval world, warriors carry weapons that trace their lineage back to a disabled young man who refused to accept that his limitations defined his possibilities. But perhaps most importantly, in the halls of innovation throughout history, Bjorn's story reminds us that the greatest breakthroughs often come from the most unexpected sources, from people who can't do things the traditional way and therefore must find better ways, from individuals who transform personal disadvantage into universal advantage through persistence, observation, and the courage to challenge everything everyone thinks they know. The curved axe revolution ended when gunpowder changed warfare forever. But the spirit of that revolution, the willingness to question, to adapt, to improve that spirit, continues in every garage, workshop, every laboratory, every place where someone looks at the way things have always been done and asks the simple, revolutionary question, what if there's a better way? That's Bjorn's true legacy. Not steel, but spirit. Not just better tools, but better thinking. Not just innovation, but the understanding that innovation is everyone's birthright, limited only by imagination and the courage to try. And in a world that still struggles with change, still resists new ideas, still believes that the way things have always been done is the way they should always be done, that legacy remains as relevant today as it was 1200 years ago in a smoky Norwegian forge, where a young man with a withered arm changed the world.